Thank you for letting me interview you today. Would each of you please introduce yourselves?
I'll start. I am Beth Walker, and I am a justice on the Supreme Court of Appeals of West Virginia.
And I am Bridget McCormack, and I'm the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court.
And I am Eva Guzman, and I am a justice on the Texas Supreme Court.
And I'm Rhonda Wood, and I'm a justice on the Arkansas Supreme Court.
I have some questions for each of you. Justice Guzman, as a Texas Supreme Court justice, can you explain the difference between a state Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court?
Sure. Our court is the highest court in Texas for civil matters. We're also the court that is responsible for administrative matters in Texas for the large part, and we're the last word on any issues that involve state law. But on constitutional questions, the United States Supreme Court is the final word. The last time a case went from the Texas Supreme Court to the United States Supreme Court was about 7 or 8 years ago. And in that case, the majority of my judges decided to go one way, and I decided to write what's called a dissent, and that's a separate writing. And when it went to the United States Supreme Court, the court agreed with me. And that was the first time in 25 years that the United States Supreme Court had looked at something that Texas did.
Justice McCormack, can you explain what types of cases the Michigan Supreme Court hears?
Sure. The Michigan Supreme Court is a court of general jurisdiction, which means we hear every single kind of case possible if we want to. We have a fully discretionary docket. We don't have any cases that we have to hear. So there's nothing that is required to be heard by us, and that means we decide what we hear. But any kind of case can come to us, and we consider lots of different kinds of cases as a result. But the way we sort of determine which of those many cases where people want us to hear them, the way we determine which ones we do hear is the 7 justices meet every week around a table, and we talk about which of the many cases that we could hear, we should hear. And we usually decide to hear cases that have importance to all the residents of Michigan, cases of first impression on a statute or a constitutional question that will have an impact on all of the people in our state.
Justice Walker, could you explain the different levels of court in West Virginia?
Sure, and that's a great question because West Virginia is a little unique about our levels of court. We have what's called small claim, well, we call them magistrate courts in West Virginia, but the general term is small claims court. So people have a disagreement that doesn't involve very much money or is a minor matter. It might be handled in our magistrate court. We have family courts, which deal with domestic issues. And then we have our trial courts, which we call circuit courts. And they handle everything, criminal, civil, anything that you might think of. All of those courts, as well as administrative agencies, appeal to our court, which is called the Supreme Court of Appeals. We just have one appellate court in West Virginia. We don't have many states. I think the other 3 states on the call actually have what's called an intermediate court. So you get to start with your trial and then go to a step, and then maybe the Supreme Court will hear it. We are both of those steps in our Supreme Court of Appeals. So we have 5 justices on our court, and we have appeals as a matter of right. So we hear every case that is appealed to us, one way or the other. We might have an oral argument, or we might decide it on the briefs or on the papers, but everything gets appealed to our court.
Justice Wood, in Arkansas, how does the judicial branch interact with the legislative and executive branches in government?
Well, so the judicial branch, of course, creates the law. I mean, not creates the law, but interprets the law. So the legislative branch will create a law, and then the executive branch as governor will sign off on the law and enforce it. And then as the judicial branch, cases come to us, and then we will sort of interpret the law. But there are times when the legislative branch will be deciding what the law should be in Arkansas, and they will ask judges to come up here and give testimony on what sort of the impact of their policy decisions as a policy body will have. And so judges sometimes interact with the legislature by testifying. And then the governor has a lot of boards and commissions to study policy issues, and he often appoints judges to serve on those. So despite, our separate roles of the three sort of independent branches, we work together on a lot of issues to sort of serve the state of Arkansas as a whole.
Justice Guzman, what is the hardest part about your job?
The hardest part of the job. Well, it's a really interesting job, and it's a job that gives me an opportunity to decide some really complex legal questions. But I think the hardest part is sometimes your heart is one place, but the law is another place, and you just have to follow the law. As Justice Wood mentioned, we don't make law, we interpret law, and there's sometimes when a legal decision doesn't align with what I would personally do. But in those are what I would personally like to see happen. But in those circumstances, the rule of law requires that we follow the law, and that's difficult. The other difficult thing is right now with what's going on with COVID-19 and the challenges presented to citizens in my state, they can't get to the courthouse. So we're doing things like this, like Zoom. Judges are working so hard to find a way to bring justice to the people that need it. And that's been very difficult. And Texas has hurricanes. We've seen things like this before, but never of this magnitude. Thank you, Blakeley. That's a great question.
Justice McCormack, if the Michigan Supreme Court makes a decision, is it the final, or can the United States Supreme Court look at it?
Great question, and the answer is it depends. Many decisions we make, we have the last word on those questions, but there is a small subset of cases where people can take if they don't like the answer we gave them, they can take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and those are questions about the United States Constitution. So if we've made a decision interpreting the United States Constitution, it is possible that a litigant can ask the United States Supreme Court to review our homework. But in most cases, we have the last word on most questions.
Justice Walker, what do you think people misunderstand or become confused about the judicial branch?
Well, I think part of it, there's probably a lot of reasons why the judicial branch is hard to understand. One of them are the judges and the lawyers, because sometimes we use words that are complicated and difficult to understand if you haven't been to law school. So I actually work really hard on that to try to use plain language. Not saying you have to make anything any easier necessarily, just use words that everyone uses in the opinions that we write. And we encourage our judges to do the same thing. So that's one thing are the words that we use. And another is the law is just kind of complicated. What we do is really technical. It's technical like engineers are technical and mathematicians are technical. Law is just a different kind of being technical. And so we do our best to explain it as best we can, but sometimes it's hard to understand. And probably the last thing is a lot of what we do involves people when they're having a very difficult time. You think about it, family court is a lot of divorces or maybe disputes about custody of children. Those are very emotional issues. And people usually don't come to court when things are great because they don't need to come to court when things are great. So they're often in, for example, criminals, if they're charged with committing a crime, that's usually not the high point of somebody's life. So that's a very difficult situation. And so that's why our responsibility is so important, because we are charged with being fair and impartial to everybody, even at these very difficult times in their lives.
Justice Wood, I've studied about kings and queens of England this year. I was wondering how much of our law is based on English law.
Oh, that's a really tough question, Blakeley, but it's a good one. So when our country first was established, I guess to explain, when we say the law, part of what we follow is the Constitution, and then we follow what's statutory law, which is what our legislatures pass. But on top of that, we have what's called common law. And so that law, a lot of it really developed out of England and was carried over. So if you think about when our country first was established and came over, the sort of initial legislators didn't had time to create statutes and laws, and they had to develop our state constitutions. But before that sort of developed, we had the common law. And so a lot of that was from England, and it's carried over. And we use a lot of terminology that sounds a little strange, but is carried over. And so one of the doctrines that's heavily debated in Arkansas, and we actually have a case right now, is on something called sovereign immunity. And we talk a lot about the state being sovereign, and sovereign really is a term for the king. So that's a really current example. We've kept some of the terminology from England.
Justice Guzman, in addition to deciding cases, what other responsibilities does a Supreme Court justice have?
So that's a great question. When you think about the responsibilities of a Supreme Court judge, each of us has assignments that come from our Chief Justice, like Chief Justice McCormack. Our Chief Justice, his name is Nathan Hecht, and he gives each of us certain administrative responsibilities. For example, one of our justices is a liaison to the State Bar of Texas. Another one may oversee the Board of Disciplinary Appeals. My responsibilities are the Permanent Commission on Children, Youth, and Families, and we work very hard to protect children in the foster care system. Then I also have access to justice, and what that means is when people are low income, they can't afford lawyers, and they will never have their legal problems resolved unless there's some way for them to get access to a lawyer or to the courthouse or to a form. And so that might be a mother who needs protection from an abusive situation. That could be a veteran who's fought for his country and he comes back and he finds himself without a job or homeless. That could be someone who, even in times of COVID-19, who's facing a very difficult circumstance and needs guardianship for their children. So there's a lot of ways that access to justice and makes it possible for people to gain access or answers to their legal questions. So those are two of my primary ones.
Justice McCormack, in Michigan, what are the requirements to be a Supreme Court justice, and are you elected or appointed?
In Michigan, we are elected. In fact, all judges are elected, although if a judge leaves the bench before there is an election, that the governor can fill the vacancy. So some people are first appointed, and then they have to stand for election in the next statewide election. But we are all elected at some point. And you had another part of your question, and I already forgot it. What was the first part of your question? I'm showing my age.
Qualifications.
Oh, qualifications. Yeah, the qualifications are actually, you only have to have been a lawyer for 5 years. So you can run for office as a judge after practicing law for 5 years. You could even run to be a justice after practicing law for 5 years. I don't think I know of anybody who's done it that quickly, and I'm not sure I would advise it, but you could do it if you wanted to.
Justice Walker, I read that you were the Chief Justice in West Virginia. What extra responsibilities does a Chief Justice have?
Well, that is a little different in every state, but in West Virginia, we take turns being Chief Justice. So there are 5 of us on the court, and we rotate or take turns being chief. And I had the honor of being the Chief Justice last year. And when you're the Chief Justice, by the terms of our Constitution, every state has a Constitution just like the US has one. Our Constitution sets the rules for the court, and it says that the Chief Justice is the administrative head of all the court system. So the Chief Justice has a lot of power in terms of deciding about whether judges can sit on cases or not. We call those recusals. Has a lot of authority just in the administration side, like not the judging side of what we do, but running the courts, how everything operates. Our court is called a unified court system. So all those levels I talked about earlier, magistrate, family, circuit, and Supreme Court of Appeals, are all under the supervision of our Supreme Court. And we're not a very large state, but our judiciary is altogether 1,500 people, which is kind of a lot of people. And so our Chief Justice is kind of like the CEO of the judiciary, the Chief Executive Officer, who's in charge of just day-to-day issues that come up. So it's a very busy job, and I was really glad to do it. In a lot of states, like in Michigan, Chief Justice McCormack has been the chief now for over a year, and I think she's going to be the chief for a while. So she's got a very busy job for a few years, but I just had the honor of doing it for 1 year.
Justice Wood, what do you do if you're deciding a case and you don't like the law?
Well, I think that Justice Guzman talked about that a little bit, and it's probably one of the most difficult parts of our job. And so we don't get to make the law, and there are times that we don't particularly care for the law. And what we have to decide is it constitutional? There are some laws we don't like, and it turns out we don't like them because they're not constitutional and they're not just, and they don't comport with sort of giving people due process. And in those cases, we find that they're unconstitutional. And so we would sort of invalidate them, is probably the easiest term to explain. But there's a lot of cases where if they meet the requirements that they are constitutional under the state constitution and the federal constitution, then it doesn't really matter what Justice Wood, whether she likes it or not. So it stands. And I always say, if I wanted to make sure that the laws passed for ones I like, then I ran for the wrong branch of government. That's the legislative branch.
Justice Guzman, has your experience in government changed the way you parent or interact with your family?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm blessed that I've been a judge for many, many years. I started on the trial court, and then I went to an intermediate appeals court, and then finally the Supreme Court. I have one daughter, and she was 7 when I got to the trial court. And I think that what it does is really, because we also run for office in Texas, I've had to spend a lot of time campaigning, and I think it really helps you prioritize time with family. It becomes incredibly valuable to have dinner because you have to go to a campaign event that evening, or that you might have to go on the road for work, and so you want to do something special with your children beforehand. So I think probably like all mothers and fathers who work outside of the home, you really learn to balance. Now, I happen to be married to a police officer, and part of me that has probably made me overprotective as a mother because I hear so much. But as far as it changing how I parent, I think it's like all working parents, makes us more aware of how important it is to cherish the time with our children and to prioritize and to always keep at the forefront what's important in life, and that's family.
Justice McCormack, what is the biggest lesson you've learned from your job?
Wow, that's a great question. The biggest is hard. I feel like I've learned so many lessons from my job, but I guess one that maybe is especially salient in a state Supreme Court where we make all of our decisions by committee. So the size of your committee depends on the size of your court. In Michigan, we're 7, and Justice Guzman has 8 colleagues. Justice Walker has 4. So we each have, Justice Wood, you have 6 or 7? I mean, 7 total? Yeah.
6. Yeah,
So
7 total.
So we make all these decisions by committee, and that really means that every single day we make a series of decisions. And if you're making them with those same 6 people every day, it really matters how those relationships work. And so I think not that I didn't value the relationships I had with colleagues in my other work. I was a law professor and I was a lawyer and had all kinds of other jobs before that, before I graduated from law school. And obviously, relationships are critical in all parts of life and probably in almost every job, but I find them especially critical when you make every decision as a group of 7. I mean, if I'm a bad listener this morning to some of my colleagues, they're probably going to remember that later today when we have to make another decision, and I want them to listen to me then. So the importance of relationships is really something that I feel like I've maybe taken to a different level now that I make decision after decision after decision by committee.
Justice Walker, do you find it difficult to stick to your own personal or spiritual values in the Constitution at the same time?
Well, I think Justice Guzman and Justice Wood have talked about this a little, and sometimes that's the challenge of what we do as judges. I have, of course, like we all do, my own moral compass, my own spiritual beliefs, and I don't necessarily set them aside. They always inform, they always are in the background of what I do, but I have to follow the law. And if the law, and when you place it that way, when you say, this is my job is to follow the law. My job is not to legislate, but rather to interpret. We leave the legislating over in the legislative branch. We are a separate branch of government that way. That's why we all do different jobs. And if you just prioritize it that way, you know that, legally you have to follow the law. And so that's kind of how I look at it. It doesn't mean it's not difficult. We have cases, all of us have cases all of the time where, they're heartbreaking and people are in very difficult situations. And sometimes you have to, favor a side that you might not favor if you were a legislator. But you know that your job is as a judge, and that's a really important one. And if you can't, I feel like that's the responsibility that's given to us. And as Justice Wood said, if I wanted to make the policy decisions that legislators make, I would be a legislator. But I have the wonderful opportunity to be a judge, and we all take that very seriously.
Justice Wood, what is your favorite part of your job?
Boy, well, one is I am an avid reader, so I do love that I get to read every day. Ever since I was a little girl, I just read, and so I do love that I grew up to have a job that I read. But I think the other part is I never forget that I get to change sort of lives and sort of do justice. So there are times where it's amazing to me that often someone can make it all the way to the Arkansas Supreme Court on their own, even without a lawyer, and plead their cause, and we grant relief to them. We've granted relief. There's a couple particular cases that stand out to me my first year on the bench here, that they hand wrote their petitions to our court without an attorney and pled for relief, and we granted it. And so the fact that I'm able to sit in that position and know that I'm able to make that kind of difference and do that day in, day out, and sort of ensure justice happens in the state of Arkansas is just, I feel blessed and fortunate to be in this position.
I'd like to ask you each a more personal question. Justice Guzman, did your Latina background impact your desire to serve on the Supreme Court?
Great question. So I do have the distinction of being the first Latina on the Texas Supreme Court and the first Latina elected to statewide office. And that in and of itself didn't motivate me necessarily, because when I was a trial court judge, I just had a dream and a goal, and I wanted to be on the Supreme Court, and that just became my goal. But what it did do, what being Latina, I think, means for me is that I hope that it inspires young children, young girls from all walks of life and all ethnicities to think about, well, if she can overcome, poverty and all those things, then I can too. And I can do this, and I can be there. And so I hope that's what it means, is that little girls all over the state can see themselves. And so for that reason, I'm really proud of it.
Justice McCormack, can you explain what your role was on the Innocence Project in Michigan?
Sure can. So before I was elected to the Supreme Court, I was a full-time member of the University of Michigan Law School faculty. I was a law school teacher, and I taught lots of traditional courses, but I also taught a lot of clinical classes. And clinical classes are where students represent clients, real clients, in real cases under the supervision of faculty members. And the idea is there are things they can learn in practice that they can't learn in the traditional classroom, especially, for example, the skills and the values of the profession. And I founded a number of clinics while I was at the University of Michigan Law School, and the last one I founded was the Michigan Innocence Clinic. There are innocence projects in every state in the country at this point. And in Michigan, when we founded the Innocence Clinic at the U of M Law School, there was a DNA Innocence Clinic in Michigan already at another law school in Lansing. But we decided to found an innocence clinic where we would focus only on cases where there was no DNA evidence. So cases where there was no biological evidence in the case. And the reason we thought that was important was because by the time we founded the clinic in 2008, the DNA exonerations had given us enough information to know that the things that go wrong to cause wrongful convictions are not limited to cases where there's biological evidence. They were just as likely to go wrong, if not more likely to go wrong, in cases where there was no biological evidence. And there was nobody focusing on those cases. So we thought, well, we have some smart law students, and this would be a great opportunity for them to learn some things that would be hard to learn in the traditional classroom. Let's see what we can accomplish. And that was why we founded the Michigan Innocence Clinic, which obviously I had to leave when I was elected to the bench in 2012, but it is going strong. I believe they have now exonerated 24 people so far. So that's pretty cool.
Justice Walker, I read that you were a Girl Scout. What skills did you learn as a Girl Scout that helped you become a Supreme Court justice?
Well, that is my favorite question because one of the things that I talk about a lot, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to do, is to be a Girl Scout. I was a Girl Scout all the way through my senior year in high school. So I started out as a brownie. They didn't have daisies then, but I started as a brownie. And I learned a lot. I learned most of all, and probably the reason I did what I did in terms of being a lawyer and then being a judge, is I learned that girls can do anything. And I learned that if you set your goals and you stick to them and you work hard, like Justice Guzman talked about, you can accomplish what you want to accomplish. And, you know, we all have a different path. I didn't know anybody, you know, a lot of folks have family members who are lawyers. I'm what we call a first generation lawyer. So I just decided I wanted to go to law school when I was in 7th grade. And I went to law school, and then I practiced law for a long time. And then I went on and ran for the Supreme Court as my very first public office, which is not the usual path. And I guess, you know, when you're a Girl Scout, you learn to get along with people because you have a troop and you plan all your events. You learn how to communicate and to interact with people, because you sell cookies, and that's how you fund the things you want to do. Like we did a lot of traveling when I was in Girl Scouts and a lot of camping. I feel like I pretty much got all the life skills I needed as a Girl Scout. I earned what's now called the Gold Award in Girl Scouts. It was called the first class when I earned it, which is the highest award in Girl Scouting. So it was just a great opportunity for me, and I'm still involved. I'm a lifelong Girl Scout. I just finished about 20 years on our local Girl Scout Council Board of Directors, and I got to be the chair of that as well. So I think it's a really great program for girls. And like I said at the beginning, I think that girls can do anything, and anything I do, I'm always trying to encourage young women to become involved. It doesn't have to be as a Supreme Court justice or a statewide elected official. You can be a leader in your community. You can help people, you can volunteer, but I'm just trying to be a good example of pursuing your dreams.
Justice Wood, you spent a lot of time as assistant dean at the law school. How did that prepare you to be a justice?
Well, I think that one of the things that having sort of a background when you're teaching is that a lot of what you do, if you sort of think about it, and if you're interested in teaching, is that you have to explain to your students. And so having a background where I was explaining the law a lot and being very precise and studying it along with my students. And so part of what we do as a Supreme Court and as justices is when we make a decision in a case, we write an opinion. And in that opinion, we not only explain sort of the decision in the case, we explain the law. And so we write it out and give an explanation so that future parties and people that have disputes can look to that case to sort of understand the law. So I think that the background that I had teaching and giving good explanations and writing and studying the law helped me, I think, be better prepared to sort of write those opinions and explain the law in those manners. That I'd like to think that prepared me to do that. So it just, a lot of times studying the law. And so in some ways I went directly from law school to the bench. I went from law school actually to the trial bench. And I will say that was not a good, I think law school was a great preparation for the appellate bench and the writing and the studying the law and those kind of decisions. And Justice McCormack will testify that faculty meetings are very similar in some respects to the court, the committee and the court decision, collaborative decision making. But going directly to the trial bench, I was not so well suited to that experience. But I adjusted well, hopefully, during my 6 years there. But good question, Blakeley.
Since each of you are from a different state, could you each share how coronavirus is affecting your court?
Sure, I'll go first. So in Texas, we have an order that requires people that are non-essential to essentially stay home, not go to work. So that's restaurants and bars and things like that, but courts are considered essential. Nonetheless, we also have an order that says that more than 10 people cannot meet. We also have an order that is closed down most of our buildings. The Texas Supreme Court is closed officially. We can go in, but the building is closed to the public. So then it becomes a challenge. We still have to have court because citizens need decisions in their cases. In criminal cases, I don't handle the criminal cases, but our criminal courts have to have hearings, family courts involving children. Let's say that a child comes into the custody of the state, there has to be a court. So most of the courts in Texas have moved to online hearings. using what we're using here, the Zoom. And so parties join remotely and judges join remotely, and decisions are still being made. And the Supreme Court has had to make orders in a lot of different things, like we stopped all evictions, so people can't get evicted from their homes until a certain date. So there's a lot going on that's keeping courts very, very busy during the pandemic.
It's similar in Michigan. You know, we have limited, the Michigan Supreme Court has issued a number of emergency orders. I think most state Supreme Courts have had to, and we all are responding to the information as it comes at us, which seems to change day to day. And so, you know, like many Supreme Courts, I think we've issued 4 emergency orders already. We'll have more to come. And because we're charged with administering the courts of the state, a lot of those are to give guidance to the trial courts. And we have limited the in-person functions in our trial courts to only emergency and essential functions, and no more than 10 people in any room at one time. But we have also encouraged and promoted remote hearings like Texas. We actually had the foresight of buying our judges Zoom licenses about 18 months ago. So all of our trial judges have Zoom licenses and are now doing Zoom hearings. We're giving them guidance and support and doing training. And they are starting to stream those live on YouTube so that the public and the media has access. But it is I always say it's a work in progress. We're learning, I think, months worth of new skills by the hour. I think that's probably ultimately a good thing. This profession was due for a bit of a technological overhaul, and there will be things we learn during this process that will make what we do better when it's over, even though we're having to learn it at a very fast clip, and it will be clunky along the way. The Michigan Supreme Court will have its first Zoom oral arguments in a couple of weeks, and I promise you mistakes will be made. Some of us will embarrass ourselves, and that's okay.
Well, I will add to that what's going on in West Virginia. A lot of the same is happening in other states. Emergency orders, limiting court hearings to essential emergency matters. We've been really concerned in West Virginia about, we have a very large number of children in foster care as a result of the opioid crisis. And so we've been very worried about making sure that all of those things get taken care of appropriately, even though the courts aren't, are very limited in what we can do. And we don't want people in groups in large groups or, coming in contact so we've been watching that really closely. Like Michigan, we're going to have our arguments in a couple weeks online. We just had a meeting about it this morning. I think we're going to try to do a trial run next week to see how many mistakes we can avoid. I'm not sure that's possible to avoid them all, but we're going to try to go online. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. We've been broadcasting, like Michigan, our Supreme Court oral arguments for a long time on our very own YouTube channel. But now the justices will all be in different places. And so that'll be a brand new experience for West Virginia. So another thing, talking about technological improvement, when I came to the court, I set up my office as paperless, which means that I don't keep things in notebooks and have a lot of books around. I have everything electronic, and I know other justices, I think, do the same. And so all of my colleagues kind of made fun of me as the paperless justice until the coronavirus. And now they want to know how the paperless justice operates, because they're trying to operate paperlessly as well with all of their staffs scattered around. So it's given me an opportunity to be a leader in that, which is very exciting. But West Virginia was the very last state to have a confirmed case of coronavirus. We're very rural and we're small, so we're trying to keep it down to a minimum. And I think everybody's working hard like they are in other states, but it's like nothing we've seen before.
In Arkansas, so we're doing the similar things that the other Supreme Courts are, and we've also suspended in-court proceedings unless they're essential. So if someone is arrested, they're still going to have a right to have have their in-person hearing if necessary. So they're not held without probable cause. The main difficulty, so if you can imagine, a lot of the hearings now are going forward in trials on something like Zoom. So they're having their trial this way. And the largest issues, if you can think of, are people that may not have the resources to participate. So if you think about people that don't have quite as much money and ability, that they may not have a laptop at home or an iPad or something that they can access Zoom. So trying to ensure that they have access to participate in their hearing. So we're trying to figure out how we deal with that. And then the second thing is our courts in America, thank goodness, are open to the public with the exception of limited circumstances. So figuring out, for instance, we scheduled this Zoom interview with you today. How would we let the press and the public have access to that? So that's where a lot of courts are either creating YouTube channels where the hearings are saved there, or that is something that a lot of our courts just weren't equipped with. And to know, how do we give the public and press access to these Zoom hearings? And like I said, making sure people that do not have the resources to necessarily have Wi-Fi or cellular or fancy devices have the ability to participate.
For my last question, if each of you can answer what advice you would give to a 10-year-old girl like me who is interested in learning more about government, history, and our court system.
Chief Justice, and I'll go after you. or whoever.
We'll defer to the chief.
I think that's a great question. And there are some obvious answers, which are, take all of the classes that are available to you in high school and college, go to college, study hard. But I would add to that, find teachers who love that subject, and then figure out how you can learn as much as possible from them. There's every school has some amazing AP government teacher, right? I mean, I don't know about everybody else, but my kids' AP government teacher sort of changed their world, even though none of them are going to law school and none of them are, I don't mean they're not interested in government, but they're doing different things. They're not going to law school, but they will all tell you that both their 8th grade US history teacher, who was government basically, and their AP government teacher had a tremendous impact on them, because they were people who loved the study of government so much themselves that they encouraged kids to figure out how to learn on their own, which ultimately we can all do, right? There's so much you can read and learn on your own, but it just takes someone to inspire you to do that. So find the teachers who love the subject, and you will learn how to learn, and that's probably the best thing you can do for yourself.
And I would say also, I'm impressed that at 10, that you're interested in government and in history, and I just think it's wonderful. And there are some online resources that schools are using that I'm sure you've been exposed to, but I started a Twitter account in Spanish to try to share information about what's going on in the courts with kids who have to, for example, translate for their parents. And one of the things I've shared on that page is a lot of resources on civics and government. So there's all these now online learning tools, which I think from my generation, we, just didn't have that access. But so in addition to reaching out to teachers, because that's always the best place, going online and kind of looking at iCivics and looking at Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's work that she started. And I think those are great resources for someone that's so passionate already about these things.
I'll go next. And those were all great suggestions that I agree with. And so I won't repeat them, but I would encourage anybody in school to you know, in addition to the academic side, the classes, get involved in activities that, you know, build your leadership skills or teach you about what's going on. You know, when I was in high school, I was involved in a group called Youth in Government. We went to the Capitol. I grew up in Ohio, so we went to Columbus, Ohio, and went to the Capitol and got to pretend we were legislators for a weekend. And that taught me a lot about how government works. So just get involved in the things that you are exposed to in school, volunteer in your community, learn about how your town or county works. Maybe go to if you have city council meetings or something. But don't feel a lot of pressure either. You're 10. So, you know, you might love government now, and you may decide you love teaching later, or you may decide you love, you know, biomedical engineering later. Try a lot of things and read a lot of things and learn a lot of things, is my advice. Don't put too much pressure on yourself.
Two things I always say, in addition to the great advice you receive from my colleagues, are find great mentors. And I think that, and I hate to say, but I think especially women are great for mentors. And it's amazing if you reach out to someone and just say, can I shadow you for an hour, and just see what you do, that people are willing. So whether it is someone that's on city council that you follow for an hour, or someone in, you know, a mayor's office, or a county, you know, judge's office, or anywhere, that it's something that interests you, or someone you're interested that does any sort of possible career, or that's involved in government at a different level of government, is seeing what you can do. Our legislature has pages every time it's in session, and you can be a page at a certain age and get that experience of how the state legislature works. But the other thing is, I'm a firm believer that I think everybody should get involved in some sort of campaign, and work on someone's campaign at some point, and maybe not at 10, unless maybe it's someone you're related to, which I think you've had that experience at a young age. But I think that, you know, part of our civic duty is to vote and to be active. But, you know, as you get older, is finding out about the candidates running for office. And even if you're not 18 and you're not eligible to vote, you can start getting informed about who the candidates are. And there are so many things you can do to work on a campaign. And even if it's someone running for school board or city council, or, you know, or it is judge, or, you know, whatever, start with a small local race that you can find, and you'd be amazed how much you learn just about government from that experience.
Thank you for spending time and letting me interview y'all today.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
It was fun.
You
Thank
did a really
you.
good job, Blakeley.
You're welcome. I'm going to try to